Have you heard the crazy people talking about 5G being dangerous? Crazy, right?
This is just one of over a dozen fires targeting 5G towers in the Netherlands. And the country isn't alone. Cyprus, Belgium, and Ireland among those home to conspiracy theorists who believe 5G may have some connection to COVID-19.
There's been studies published saying it's harmless to us. The media says there aren't any negative side effects.
So should we be concerned, though, in a household environment or in the office environment where there is so much Wi-Fi and other electromagnetic radiation around us, the cumulative effect is going to affect us?
We've been doing studies on this for the best part of, say, 30 years, seriously. About 20 years ago, I wrote a story in one of my books called The Killing Fields, saying people are worried about it. And back then we were having statistical links that people who are exposed to higher levels of non-ionising radiation, say from living underneath power lines, were having higher incidences of leukemia. In the 30 years since then, we've found nothing.
Have you done any research for yourself? Or have you trusted what you've been told?
Hello, my name is Frank Clegg, and I've spent over 40 years in the technology sector. My most recent position as a president of Microsoft Canada. In my career, I've seen the tremendous benefit that technology can provide. I've also seen the potential harm if technology is not implemented correctly. I am especially concerned about our current implementation of 5G wireless technology. And the more research I do and the more experts I talk to, the more concerned I become. Now, there's no doubt that there are benefits such as autonomous vehicle and faster download speeds. At the same time, I think there is potential harm. I think it's important that we understand that 5G is not just an incremental number on our cell phones. In fact, over 230 scientists and researchers from 41 countries around the world have formally written to the United Nations, their member nations, and the World Health Organization, expressing their concern over the planned rollout of 5G technology, especially for vulnerable populations such as children, pregnant women, and the environmentally sensitive. They have been joined by state legislatures and federal regulators who have asked the FCC to provide evidence that there is no harm from the rollout of 5G technology. There is no doubt that the engineers and businesses and companies that roll out technology are well-meaning. However, their focus is on being first to market and getting new products into the market as efficiently and quickly as they can. I am not aware of any research or studies by my industry or related industry that deal at all with the health or safety effects of wireless technology. Here are some important facts about 5G. 5G technology has not been tested. I am not aware of a single study that shows that 5G technology is safe. 5G, as in all other wireless technology, gives off radio frequency radiation, which is absorbed in the human body and accumulates in the human body. In fact, all of these health factors and conditions have risen exponentially over the last 30 years, and hundreds of studies that show proof of biological harm from wireless devices. Most recently, in 2018, the National Institute of Health's National Toxicology Program released the findings of a 14-year, $25 million study that showed clear evidence of harm in terms of cancer and permanent DNA damage. This study, several months later, was verified by the prestigious Ramazzini Institute out of Italy, which found the same results. Now you may ask how a product that has this potential harm could ever be released to the market and to the public for public use. The Federal Telecommunications Act of 1996 prohibits any telecommunication company to be sued on the basis of the safety or health of their products. So in other words, there is no liability to the telecommunications industry of any of the impacts of their products. Just last week, the reinsurer Swiss Re came out with their annual forecasts, and they specifically identified 5G technology as an upcoming insurable health concern globally over the next 3 years. There is also mounting evidence that the telecommunications industry knew about the potential impacts of RF radiation years ago. And in fact, we're starting to see some of the behavior from my industry similar to what the tobacco industry did over the last few decades. The telecommunications industry has over 500 lobbyists working in Congress and other areas of legislature protecting the industry. Together, all of these issues that I've referenced, plus the general lack of awareness in the general public, have led us to the situation where we are today. So where are we today? Today we currently have a significant amount of exposure in our homes, in our businesses, in our schools, and in most public areas we go to. Many states and cities around the world are debating and passing legislation about the rollout of 5G technology. And in fact, what we're seeing in the US is at the federal and the state level, they're fast-tracking some of this legislation to support the rollout of 5G infrastructure. Unfortunately, this legislation seems to be taking away all individual rights and the rights of local towns and counties and cities and passing more power to the telecommunication companies. We believe this is a historic and precedent-setting power shift from the individual and state and local level over to an industry. In fact, many communities in the US and around the world are passing moratoriums preventing the rollout of 5G technology until it is proven safe. 5G will impact you personally. There are designs that show the requirement for small cell 5G antennas as close as every third house in the neighborhood and could be as close as every 500 feet in public areas. The impact of that radiation at that level of frequency and intensity and power 24 hours a day and 7 days a week is unprecedented and is not understood.
I want to share with schools in your communities reviews the electromagnetic spectrum, summarizes the science showing effects from low, intermediate, and high frequencies, makes recommendations for electromagnetic hygiene in schools, and links to many of the best reports and resolutions, including the Freiburg resolution signed by thousands of doctors in Germany. The Bragg report also graded all schools in U.S. state capitals by their proximity to cell towers. They looked at how close is the closest tower to a school, how many within a quarter mile, which is or about 400 meters, where most of the science is showing electrosensitivity symptoms and cancer incidents, as well as how many antennas within 0.6 of a mile, or approximately 1 kilometer, to account for children being more vulnerable. 63% of U.S. students in state capitals are at risk for possible microwave radiation overexposure based on distance as a gauge. As you know, there are other factors besides distance, such as the characteristics of the antenna, the direction, the topography, the foliage, and so forth. Many schools were also found to have antennas and cell towers right on school property. Based on the evidence of risk in the scientific literature, the Bragg report recommended that no school permit antennas on their property and have a setback of 1,500 feet for neighborhood antennas near the school. There was a review of the cell tower science published by Dr. Henry Lai and Blake Levitt in 2010 that was published in Environmental Reviews. It included over 100 citations, approximately 80% of which showed biological effects, and the vast majority of those adverse. This report also builds the case for setbacks and the need for new exposure guidelines reflecting more realistic, multiple, and cumulative exposures instead of the assumption of a brief single exposure on which the guidelines are based today. On August 31st this year in Rajasthan, India, the largest state in the Republic of India, the High Court banned cell towers on or in the vicinity of schools, hospitals, and jails. In compliance with this order in September, 2 weeks later, 200 cell towers near schools were shut down. And another 500 are coming down near jails and hospitals. India has also been out front and looking carefully at the wildlife effects from cell towers. In August, an expert committee submitted a report to the Minister of Environment and Forests. They reviewed over 919 studies of the effects of mobile towers on animals, insects, humans, and plants, and the panel found that 593, or 65%, showed harmful impacts. The report said, the review of existing literature shows that the EMRs are interfering with the biological systems in more ways than one, and there had already been some warning bells sounded in the case on bees and birds, which probably heralds the seriousness of this problem, the seriousness of this issue, and indicates the vulnerability of other species as well. Other good news comes from Chile. In June, after debating this subject for over a decade, the Chilean Congress voted by a large majority of the members of the Congress for something called the Towers Act. It limits the power of antennas, calls for infrastructure sharing, allows citizen participation in the approval or denial process, requiring prior permission of and terms from local communities, allows for reassessment of tax valuations if you live near a cell phone tower. Communities are also being to be compensated by the telecom providers where there are towers, providing funds for public space enhancement and then improvement. And importantly, there was a retroactive component establishing mitigation in areas that are saturated with antennas, including those close to homes or institutions such as kindergartens, health centers, or schools. The World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer to classify radiofrequency radiation as a Class 2B possible carcinogen. For the first time, this decision provides an official scientific basis on which governments, schools, and parents can legitimately call for precautionary measures regarding radiation-emitting devices and infrastructure. Robert Bond, who was Robert Bond, who was the principal author of the IARC statement, has clarified that this decision to classify radiofrequency radiation, which is based largely on cell phone science, also applies as well to all radiofrequency radiation from towers, from smart meters, etc. I just read yesterday that Nobel laureate Luc Montagnier is working on 5 papers on this subject. He is the French virologist who discovered the HIV virus and who is now looking intensively at subtle energy effects. When his colleagues in Europe had trouble understanding this new direction that he was taking, they kind of poo-pooed his exploration, and he's now being hosted by Beijing University that has rolled out a red carpet and actually built a building in his name. Here's a shot of the density of antennas today compiled with FCC data a few years ago. We have to always remember to take the macro view to look at, do we understand the insanity of what we're doing? Beyond electrosensitivity symptoms near cell phone antennas, many studies have shown a connection with cancer. In this study, German doctors have found that the proportion of newly developing cases is significantly higher among patients who live within 400 meters of a cell phone transmitter. The relative risk of getting cancer in this study increased by 200% after 5 years operation of the transmitter. In Israel, a study by Wolf et al. Similarly showed that within 350 meters of cell phone antennas, there was a 300% increase incidence of cancer among men and women, and a 900% cancer increase among women alone. Faculty at Tel Aviv University found a 4-fold increase in cancer rates among Israelis living for over a decade within 350 meters of a cell phone tower. Tower exposure studies in Israel have also shown, as has been shown in many other countries like France, Germany, and Austria, neurobehavioral malfunction, lower than average performance tests for attention, short-term memory, and problem solving, and a host of other inexplicable illnesses. Here's an image from Full Signal, the film that you saw on Friday night, and it shows that cancer clusters in the town of Sifia, Israel, occurred only in the vicinity where the cell towers have been placed. Who would like to see this kind of research done in the United States, in our towns? I will add anecdotally that it is not uncommon to hear people who have been diagnosed with cancer say that their diagnosis was preceded by many years by symptoms of electrosensitivity. Very briefly, here's an overview of the kinds of issues that are biological effects of electromagnetic fields in the literature, emitted by cell phone, by microwave cell phones, Wi-Fi, portable phones, etc., and more. So as you can see, there is a broad range of effects, and including important DNA effects that you heard about yesterday from Dr. Blank. So there's no question that electromagnetic field exposure is degrading our biology, and that an industry-funded report released in 2000 called the Echolog Report outlined the primary biological effects very clearly, including gene toxicity that you heard Dr. Blank talk about, impacts on cellular processes, cell communication, and cell proliferation, pathological effects on the immune system, central nervous system, including the blood-brain barrier, neurotransmitters, EEG, and cognitive functions. Effects on hormone systems, including the stress hormones and also melatonin, which is a highly important cancer substance. The Echolog report also presented extensive evidence for the EMF association with cancer and infertility.
Now, I have 10 minutes. I wasn't sure I was going to get to this stage, but I can't help but say something about this whole coronavirus thing, if you want me to. Yes. So, again, when you know Steiner, you have the answers to the test, but you have to then figure out the details. In 1918, after the biggest pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, Steiner was asked, what was this all about? And he said, well, viruses are simply excretions of a toxic cell. Viruses are pieces of DNA or RNA with a few other proteins. They bud out from the cell. They happen when the cell is poisoned. They are not the cause of anything. And the first way I would encourage you to think about this is if you are a famous dolphin doctor, right? And you have been studying dolphins in the Arctic Circle for hundreds of years, or at least a long time, and the dolphins were fine. And then they call you up, Fred, all the dolphins, or a lot of the dolphins are dying in the Arctic Circle. Can you come and investigate? Right? And you have one question to ask. So, show of hands. How many of you would say, I want to investigate a dolphin to see the genetic makeup of that dolphin? Nobody, because that's stupid. How many of you would say, I want to see if this dolphin and that dolphin has a virus because it might be contagious and that's why all these dolphins are getting sick? That fellow. How many of you would say, excuse my French here, somebody put some shit in the water here? Like Exxon Valdez? Anybody? Everybody. Because that's what happened. And the cells get poisoned. They try to purify themselves by excreting debris, which we call viruses. If you go to the current theory of viruses called exosomes, and the latest head of the NIH giving a talk on the complexity of viruses, you will see this is perfectly in line with the current thinking on what a virus really is. I had a dramatic example of this when I was growing up. Right outside our house, there was a wetlands, and it was full of frogs, and the frogs kept me up at night, so I taped the windows, and in the spring they made a big racket. And then over time, the frogs were all gone. How many thinks the frogs had a genetic disease? How many thinks the frogs had a virus? How many think somebody put DDT into the water? That's what happened. Diseases are poisoning. It's one of the reasons why vaccines, so let me skip that for a minute. So what happened in 1918? There was a huge, in every pandemic in the last 150 years, there was a quantum leap in the electrification of the Earth. In 1918, late fall of 1917, there was the introduction of radio waves around the world. Whenever you expose any biological system to a new electromagnetic field, you poison it, you kill some, and the rest go into a kind of suspended animation so that, interestingly, they live a little bit longer and sicker. And then starts in World War II with the next pandemic with the introduction of radar equipment all over the Earth, blanketing the entire Earth in radar fields. First time humans have ever been exposed to that. In 1968, there was the Hong Kong flu, and it was the first time the Earth has a protective layer in the Van Allen belt, which essentially integrates the cosmic fields from the sun and the Earth, from the moon and Jupiter, etc., integrates that and essentially distributes that to the living beings of the Earth. And we put satellites emitting radioactive frequencies in the Van Allen belt. Within 6 months, we had a new viral pandemic. Why viral? Because the people are poisoned, they excrete toxins, they look like viruses. People think it's a flu epidemic. In the 1918 epidemic, the Boston Health Department decided to investigate the contagiousness of this. So they, believe it or not, took hundreds of people with the flu and they sucked the snot out of their nose and injected it into the healthy people who didn't have the flu, and not one time could they make the next person sick. They did this over and over again, and they were not able to demonstrate contagion. They even did it with horses who apparently got the Spanish flu, and they put bags over their head, and the horses sneezed in the bag, and they put the bag over the next horse, and not one horse got sick. You can read about this in a book called The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg, who chronicles all the steps in the electrification of the Earth and how within 6 months there was a new flu pandemic all over the world. And when you hear the normal explanations, how did it go from Kansas to South Africa in 2 weeks? So the entire world got the symptoms at the same time, in spite of the fact that the mode of transportation was horseback and boats, and there's no explanation for it. They just say, we don't know how that happened. But when you think about it, with these radio waves and other frequencies that some of you have in your pocket and on your wrist, you can send a signal to Japan and it arrives instantaneously. So any of you who don't believe there is an electromagnetic field that communicates globally within seconds just is not paying attention to this. And I will only finish by pointing out that there has been a dramatic and quantum leap in the last 6 months with the electrification of the Earth. And I'm sure a lot of you know what that is. It's called 5G, where they now have 20,000 radiation-emitting satellites, just like the radiation-emitting thing in your pocket and on your wrist and that you use all the time. That is not compatible with health. I'm sorry to say it, it's not compatible with health. That is a water destructuring device. And for any of you who say, yeah, well, we're not electrical beings, we're just physical matter, then don't bother doing an EKG or an EEG or a nerve conduction test, because we are electrical beings and the chemicals are only the byproduct of those electrical impulses. And I'll finish with, anybody want to make one guess as to where the first completely blanketed 5G city in the world was? Exactly. So when you start thinking about this, we are in an existential crisis here, folks, the likes of which humankind has never seen. And I don't want to go all Old Testament prophet on you, But this is something that is unprecedented. The putting of 100,000 satellites in the very blanket of the Earth. And by the way, as I was going to say earlier, this actually has something to do with the vaccine question. And this got brought home to me because about a year ago or so, I had a patient who came in who was totally fine, a surfer and all, and then he works as an electrician putting in Wi-Fi systems for very wealthy people. Electricians have a very high mortality rate, but he was fine. And then he breaks his arm and he gets a metal plate put in his arm. 3 months later, he couldn't get out of bed and was total, heart irregularities, just total collapse. The susceptibility has to do with how much metal you have in your body, as well as the quality of the water in your cells. So if you start injecting aluminum in people, they become receptors for absorbing increased electromagnetic fields, and that is a perfect storm for the kind of deterioration of the species, which is what we're now experiencing.
And I've worked at some of the top institutions in the world in science, and so when I first thought there could be something wrong with mobile phones, I actually owned 3 phones at the time. I own 2 now. And everybody has to downsize a bit. And I didn't believe there was a problem, and I thought if there were a problem, I would know about it because, of course, I knew all about what was important in science. Well, I was wrong. I liked the fact that I could call people or actually send them messages and expect an answer at all hours of the day, and found it kind of fun in the beginning. And when somebody said to me there could be a problem with this with our health, I said, oh, don't be ridiculous. If there was a problem, I'd know about it. Well, I was wrong. How many of you have an iPhone? Now, I assume you didn't all turn them off. So, for those of you who have an iPhone, would you nod, raise your hand again? I'd like you to share with your colleagues. So please go to the settings on your phone, all right? Please take a moment and nod when you've got there. All right? And be prepared to share, all right? Go to settings on the phone. Got there? All right. Now, get to settings. Now go to about. I'm sorry, you have to go to general first. There's a mistake here. You have to go to general. All right? Under general, under settings. Then go to about, which is at the top. You got there? About, yes? Okay. Now you have to scroll all the way down to something you don't normally see, called legal. You got to legal? All right. Now click on RF exposure. Now you can read it later, but it's basically telling you that you need to know that you cannot keep the phone directly next to your body without exceeding the as-tested exposure guidelines. And by the way, the iPhone does it. I happen to know how to find it on the iPhone. I'm just learning the Android system myself. But all smartphones come with some information that basically says, don't keep the phone in your pocket or you will exceed the as-tested exposure guidelines. Now, how many of you knew that before today? Well, this is a very well-informed audience relative to others. This is from Arpanza. You will see here they say FM radio, microwave oven, radiant heat. Of course, microwave oven actually happens to be of the same frequency as the cell phone, the mobile phone. The mobile phone and the microwave oven use a very similar frequency. The difference between them is power. The power of the microwave oven is 1,000 watts. And of course, that's power that can heat up a cup of water in maybe 60 seconds. The microwave oven, the mobile phone, the cordless phone, the Wi-Fi monitor, the baby monitor, they all use the same frequency. They differ in power. They also differ because mobile phones and Wi-Fi devices emit pulsed microwave radiation. It's the pulse, not the power, that appears to be biologically most important. the pulse that is erratic and irregular, like for thousands of minutes a month, for dozens of hours a week, over a lifetime, that irregular pulsed signal may be much more biologically important. And in fact, the continuous wave signals have a lot of therapeutic effects as are being applied in medicine today. This is just to show you what happens in a 4-second mobile phone call. This is power density indicated here. And of course, a phone is on standby, it's not doing too much, but 900 times a minute, it's looking for a signal. It says to the tower, where are you? Here I am. Where are you? Here I am. It's smart. That's how it's supposed to do. Now, when the phone rings, the worst time for you to put a phone right next to your head is when you answer it and say hello, because it's smart and it goes to max power. They're programmed to do that. Max power. Now, it's going to go to max power. You're going to listen, and then it will go up and down and up and down. And again, it's that variation, it's the delta, it's the cumulative integrative dose under the curve over a lifetime of exposure that looks to be biologically important. Now, way back in the dark ages, when the standards were developed, two-dimensional modeling showed that children and smaller adults might absorb more radiation than larger adults. And this was scalar modeling that has now been superseded, done by Om Gandhi in 1996. Interestingly, and this is why I'm really delighted to be here, Dean, when he did this work in 1996, he was working with support from Motorola and the Department of Defense. And after he published this, he lost all his funding. That's why I'm really happy when you told me that Australia is not America. Because I think you have an opportunity to do something here in this great country. You have a tradition of independence in science and in this country that we do not have, unfortunately, on this issue in the United States. So Professor Gandhi, with whom I'm collaborating now, updated his work in 2002, here showing you that a smaller adult head here, you see the amount of exposure is quite similar, but because the head is smaller, it will absorb proportionally more. More recently, we have been working with colleagues at Porto Alegre with Environmental Health Trust, and we have developed three-dimensional modeling with anatomically based models using MRI to create the models with 1 millimeter voxels. And what we have done is to show the difference in radiation dose in heads of different ages and sizes. And I'll just show you one example here, coming from our colleagues at the Swiss National Institute of Technology, the ITIS, which have produced some of the most brilliant work in the world in this field. And they have shown here, of course, that there is going to be greater exposure, absorption into a younger head versus an older head. This is another item from their website of target tissue dose for the infant with using a system called the virtual family. Is there anyone here who's worked on the virtual family? Right. It's a really powerful and very sophisticated system that is used today to set standards for medical devices and surgical procedures, but it's not used for mobile phone standards. I find that odd. And I want to show you an example of some of the work that we are doing now that I'm releasing here for the first time. And this is a modeled microwave radiation dose of a 6-year-old with greater levels to the frontal and temporal lobes, eyes and cheek. And watch this here. Now, yellow, white, and red are the hottest, all right? And if you look carefully, you will see it's going into the eye, the nose. Do it again, just so you'll get to see it. And partly into the brainstem. The next slide is going to show you something that might be of interest to students and faculty here. And that has to do with exposure to the reproductive organs. We call them the gonads. I think you say the testicles. And bone marrow, and look here at the radiation as it gets into the groin area. And that's just from having a mobile phone modeled into the pocket. And this, again, is based on normalized SAR with a dipole antenna. Based on this work and other studies that have been done around the world, the United States magazine Consumer Reports recently recommended that nobody keep a phone in their pocket. Nobody. And in fact, if phones were tested in pockets, they would exceed the as-tested exposure guidelines, which is why Telstra has recently issued that advice. From mobile phone radiation, as well as from iPads, which I should add, iPads and other devices are called tablets because they belong on tables. They are tested 20 centimeters away from that big guy that I showed you before. 20 centimeters away. They are not approved to be held in the laps of little children, although millions of kids are having them now in schools because the people involved in educational technology and those involved in public health research are not talking to one another. Because if they were, they would understand that you're giving children a two-way microwave radiating device, and if you must give them such a device for learning purposes, put it on airplane mode so that it's not sending and receiving signals as it does otherwise. Now, this is some new modeling, again, that we've developed with colleagues in Brazil, and we can share with you how we've done it. We first start out with the MRI and create the model with 1 millimeter voxels, and this is quite a bit of work goes into creating this, and here is what it looks like after a period of 6 minutes. That's really not as bad as it might look because you see the red area only gets partway through the eye of the adult, right? The one that we're really concerned about is this one with the young child. And this is a 3-year-old brain that we modeled. And you see that by the end of that 6-minute call, the peak radiation, yellow and red, is getting all the way into almost both eyes. This is showing you cellular damage that occurred in animals that were prenatally exposed to mobile phone radiation that was produced by a computer simulating the mobile phone exposure under controlled conditions, right? So, because you can't really get rats to make phone calls. You've got to model the exposure. And what they did is they measured in, these are your controls that you compare things with, and these were the exposed. Prenatally exposed, just 15 minutes a day for 7 days. Not much exposure. But these are small animals, and they grow within 3 weeks. They reproduce. And what they were able to study was changes in liver malonaldehyde, which is a measure of peroxidation, is a measure of damage to the liver, right? So these animals basically had significant damage to their liver. And now, the issue is, why does it take 500 million sperm to make just one healthy baby? It takes a lot of sperm to make a healthy baby. The answer is because sperm don't know how to ask for directions. But they are easy to study. And these research has been done in India, in the United States, at the Cleveland Clinic, and around the world. So many different studies have been done on sperm damage associated with mobile phone radiation that in the 7th edition of the textbook, Biostatistics in Medicine, Stanton Glantz concludes that the evidence linking mobile phone radiation to sperm damage is causal, meaning there clearly is a cause of damage to sperm from mobile phone radiation. Now, we have a lot of uncertainties in this field. The truth is, we have a lot of uncertainties, but not about sperm. There, the evidence has become rather strong, and it's become clear, so clear that the Indian government has issued warnings about this, that clinics that deal with reproductive problems are routinely advising young men to get those phones out of their pockets, recognizing that this is a hidden hazard to healthy reproduction. This is the data from the Cleveland Clinic showing that men who keep cell phones in their pockets the longest have the lowest sperm count. And again, there are many other studies with similar results. So we can debate legitimately the question of brain cancer, and I would welcome an open and honest debate about that question. But when it comes to issues like this, there really is not much to debate. But taking middle-aged rats, 70-day-old male rats, that's middle age for a rat, and exposing them 2 hours a day for 45 days to a computer-generated mobile phone signal. And those results show lower testosterone, which is a very important hormone for a male. Men and women both have testosterone. Men just need a lot more of it. And also increases of DNA damage as measured by certain enzymes. And the offspring had lower fertility. And this is just to show you, this is a normal testis. You see the boundaries, the cell wall. It looks very nice. And this is after microwave radiation exposure. But the fact is, the group that reviewed this evidence for the World Health Organization looked at all the evidence at the time in 2011. And at that time, they said it's important to conduct additional research and it's important to take pragmatic measures to reduce exposure. Now, that's why it's wonderful that Telstra is giving this advice, but we are not conducting additional research. And in fact, the World Health Organization itself is no longer conducting a leading study on brain cancer and mobile phones. Environmental Health Trust, the organization that I head, published an article in 2013 saying that we think that mobile phone radiation is a probable human carcinogen. And I want to show you briefly the reasons why we reached that conclusion. These are studies published since the World Health Organization IARC review in 2011. So these are newer studies. Here, Hardell from Sweden and Serenat from France. And what these are showing you is that the relative risk of developing brain cancer with more than 1,640 hours of lifetime use of a phone is almost 3 times higher compared to people who did not use mobile phones. In fact, most epidemiologic studies find no increased risk of brain cancer from mobile phone radiation. They don't. Until 10 years of heavy use. And by the way they define a cell phone user in these studies, I'm not making this up, is somebody who makes 1 call a week for 6 months. Yes, yes. 1 call a week for 6 months. That was the definition in these studies, which, by the way, don't find any increase. 10 minutes of mobile phone radiation daily for 10 days, worker bees did not return to test colonies. And this would be something that could easily be replicated. So now we have to deal with the reality. There are many inconsistent results. I'm not just skimming the cream here and showing you the positive ones. There are a lot of studies that find nothing at all. Nothing. Why? Well, first of all, sometimes they study different cell cultures. So if you're looking for adult cells, they may be much more robust than if you're looking at neuronal stem cells. And that turns out to be the case. Sometimes they're using different exposures. If you're looking at continuous wave versus digital pulse signals, if you're looking at a square wave versus a sine wave. There's also another fact we have to talk about, which is yet another reason why I'm glad that Australia is not America. Sponsored research, this is to put it politely, can induce publication bias. Another way to say this is that where you stand on an issue depends on where you sit and who's bought your chair. And there's a tremendous amount of sponsored research by people who are hired to do studies to find no effect. And that's plagued this field in a number of countries, including within the government itself. So I don't know about the details here with ARPANSA, but I can tell you in the United States today, the gentleman who is directing the Federal Communications Commission, Tom Wheeler, was for 10 years the executive director of the Cell Phone Telecommunications Industry Association. And now he's in charge of regulating those devices. So it's challenging to have a neutral playing field under that circumstance. One example, the US Congress asked for a study of what needed to be done on mobile phone radiation in 1993, in 1998, in 2002, in 2012. That's how many times they've asked for that study to be done. So each time a study is done, and each time the conclusion is reached, we need more research. We need more research. Well, that's my bread and butter. Of course we need more research. But if instead of funding the research, all you're doing is calling for it, then it becomes a bit of a smokescreen. So that's part of our challenge on this issue. It's a lot easier to call for research than it is to carry it out. This research is hard to do. It's not simple. There are real complexities to this field. Unfortunately, at least in the past, industry had a very clear strategy. And in my book, Disconnect, I document and quote in the new afterword that in 1994, when industry first became aware that there were studies suggesting that mobile phone radiation could damage brain cells of rats, a memo was written to, quote, war-game the science. War-game the science. This issue is far too important to be gamed. It's not a matter of war. It's a matter of the future health of your children and grandchildren. And that's why it's really a special honor for me to be here today to talk with you about what could be done. Here are some of the policy responses that have developed so far. There are right-to-know laws and policies. Labeling is spreading. Headsets must be provided with all phones in a number of countries, and I'll get to those in a moment. There are changes in hardware and antenna design and software, operating systems that can be developed. And there are also changes to what we demand for proof, of evidentiary burden. Any lawyers here? Right. So the evidentiary burden that's being required for proof of harm is changing. Do you really want to have to prove that there's a significant increased risk of brain cancer before taking steps to reduce exposures to prevent that harm from happening? That's really the question. How much evidence do we need before taking precautionary steps? And that's what brings me back to my days at the National Academy of Sciences when we seriously looked at the evidence on passive smoke and airplane travel. We only finally took steps to act when it became clear that children of smokers were hospitalized more often. That was the evidence that we had to have. And I would suggest that at this point, we should be able to do better as a civilization.